Yeah, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to my talk about you may not need JavaScript. In the next about 40 minutes, I will talk about the recent project that I'm working on. And I like to show you some frameworks that you can use as a Java developer to build modern web application simply without using JavaScript or TypeScript, just with Java. So first, some words about me. I started my software development career 26 years ago. Since 2001 or since 2000, I'm working in the Java environment, and I'm a self-employed contractor working for various customers in Switzerland, and I'm also a teacher at the University of Bern. You will find all the code samples on this GitHub project. You should see also the slides in the scheduling platform where you can download it, and then you will have the link. First, some words about the project. So here on this screen, you can see that we had the need for modernization of a ERP system. So my client is an ERP product company in Switzerland, and they have a ERP system that are used by small and medium businesses in Switzerland and also in Germany. And this was built already more than 30 years ago, and it was improved over the time, but it is based on Oracle Forms. And the left screen that you can see is screen generated by Oracle Forms. It generates AWT swing and uses Java Web Start to execute. And so they want to have something more modern. Especially they want to move to the web because Web Start is no longer supported officially. And on the other hand, a lot of people want to use it anywhere in the world. So it doesn't matter if they install it or not. So we need to have a web application. And what you see on the right side is the current state of the application. We are not yet finished. We are in the progress of migrating the old application to the new web application. So it's still work in progress. Maybe some numbers about the project. As I already said, it's based on Oracle Forms. They have around 800 forms. That means they have around 800 screens and dialogues. The system all over has close to 2,000 tables and views, and all the business logic is in the database. So they have procedures, functions, packages where they have their business logic. And the special thing about the system is because it's a product, it's adaptable by the customer. So the customer can choose how the screens look like, for example. They can choose what data they want to see. And they also build for customers individual software or individual enhancements of this ERP system. And the goal was to build a modern web front end. And this project started with another approach. Because they were used to Oracle Forms, they also use Oracle Apex, so Application Express. It's a low-code platform. And they thought maybe we can solve this problem or build a new web application also with kind of a low-code platform. And they started with it, but the progress was not as they expected. And so that's the time when I came in. They wanted me to help them to migrate the system. And we had a look at this low-code platform together, and we did some workshops, and we found out that the low-code platform is a typical 80-20 solution. So you will have quick results, but at the end, all the special things that they've built for their customers will be very hard to implement at the end. So what we did then, we thought, how can we do this in a more convenient way that it's really fits the needs of this ERP system. And the first thing that was interesting is we had a look at this low-code platform they were trying to use. And this low-code platform was written in Java, so you could write Java code, and at the end it generated either a Swing application or a Vaadin web application. And so we had a look at this Vaadin framework, and I knew Vaadin from the past. I didn't use it in big projects before, but I just did some prototypes in the past with this framework as well. And we had a look at the framework, and we said, hey, we are here, we are database developers, or the customer has database developers. They have some Java developers as well. And so they thought, that's our stack. So why not have a deeper look into this system? And that's the reason why I'm talking to you about Vaadin today. It's all about Java development. A special thing that we have to build, and this is also still work in progress, we have a UI editor, and you can see it's a typical UI tree on the left. You also see these colors here with that's this individual styling that you can do for the customer. So for example, for this field here, we have 3 different configurations. And what you see on the right-hand side, that's a typical property editor that you know from any UI editor framework that you have. We don't have yet a visual representation of the UI. So if we develop, or if the customer then will change things on the ERP system, he has to have a second browser and reload the UI to see if the changes match the expectations. But that's probably something that we will do later, because now we are in progress of migrating that. So as you can see here, we can customize the UI, and this leads to the solution that we create the UI at runtime. So the process is, as you see in this diagram, the user accesses certain module like order management system, or maybe the customer management system. And then the UI will generate it based on the data in the database, where all the configuration is stored, but also based on the rights of the user. So maybe user only can have read access to the UI, or on the other hand, we have various types of orders, for example. So you have a purchase order, or you have a canceling of the order, and maybe you have an invoice in the order system. And all these types of data may have different screens, or the screen looks different based on the type of the order that you want to display. And that's what we do here. And so after this access, the UI is ready. That means also, as you can imagine, the first access to the UI may be a bit slower, and after that it will be stored in kind of a cache, or in the session that we know that we already accessed the screen from the user, and then it's pretty much faster in the second run. So as you said, we were looking at Vaadin, and I like to show you what Vaadin is. Maybe you know it already. If you know it from the past, so if you've done Vaadin 10 years ago, for example, then it's not the same framework anymore. It has just the same name, but they did a complete overhaul a few years ago. So if you look at the history, we see that Vaadin is already 20 years old. This is a very old framework at the end, but this doesn't matter that it's old framework. It's a modern framework, but with a long history. And a lot of people that are using Vaadin or have used Vaadin started around year maybe 2009. That's when Vaadin created Vaadin version 6, and they were using GWT. GWT is Google Web Toolkit. That was the idea of generating JavaScript code from Java. The framework still exists, is under active development still, but it's no longer maintained by Google, because Google moved then to other frameworks, for example, Angular later on, and they no longer wanted to maintain this system. So these versions 6, 7, and 8, 7 and 8 particularly, are still used in the community, or applications are built with this old version. But what's interesting is Vaadin version 10, and that is also the time when I came in the project. then Vaadin introduced the new version of Vaadin. And Vaadin 10 and later versions are based on web components. And they built a complete new architecture. We will have a look at the architecture now, how this works. But Vaadin had also another idea, and the idea here is came up with Vaadin 15, and they brought another framework that's called Vaadin FUSION. Vaadin FUSION is an idea to have or to use this web component directly with TypeScript and don't do the development of the application on the server side, like with Vaadin Flow that I will show you later on, but like you do it with, for example, Angular or React. But with the difference that you use lit element now. When Vaadin started with Vaadin Flow in 2019, they were using Polymer framework, but Polymer framework now became lit element, or lit element is the more modern, or lit as the framework is the more modern web component framework, and everything is based now on lit with the newest versions, and so you can use them directly. It's also possible to have a hybrid model where you use Java on the back end, also Java for the front end, and mix it with, for example, with TypeScript and lit element. But that's not the talk today. I will have other talks about these topics today. I want to focus on Java development. So maybe before we start to look at Vaadin, we should see what UI models we have traditionally and where Vaadin fits in. First of all, we have server-side frameworks like JSF, Spring, MVC with Timeleaf, or any other server-side rendered frameworks. These are still used. There are use cases for using that. But most of the time, people are creating single-page applications today. Usually they use React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, whatever framework would be the newest kid on the block today. But also Vaadin, despite it has a total different programming model, is a single-page application. Means the first request downloads kind of a shell page or a more or less empty HTML page with some references to JavaScript, and then all other requests will be, for example, REST calls that deliver some kind of JSON usually, and then the page is rendered on the client side. So Vaadin is written, or you feel like writing on the server side, but in the runtime, it's a single-page application traditionally. A special thing about Vaadin is the scope. When you use JSF, for example, you usually have a session scope. When you use JavaScript, you have the scope, the session on the client. So you have all the state on the client, and the server becomes completely stateless. That has some advantages. When you want to scale horizontally, for example, then you don't have any need for session application or something like that, because the session state is not on the server. We could also speak from a client-server application, because it's the same model as you do like Swing or JavaFX application. When we have a look at the Vaadin here on the lower image, then we see that the state for a Vaadin Flow application is on the server. Why is that? The idea is that you have a server-side programming model, but with all the benefits of a client programming model. So that means you always have a representation of the UI on the server, and you can change, for example, the values of the components on the server, and this will be reflected on the client side, and therefore you have the state on the server. If you look at the TypeScript model with Vaadin FUSION, there you could build also completely stateless applications. When we were looking at Vaadin, we saw this this statefulness, but usually it's not a problem. You know, I'm talking about an ERP system, and that means we have a common business application. What does this mean, a common business application? A business application like an ERP system usually has a lot of screens, a lot of database tables, a lot of data. But what a business application usually doesn't have is a large amount of users. So usually there are specialized people in a company that are working with such a business application. And therefore, it's usually not a requirement to scale this application horizontally. It's more important to have a stable system, but not you don't have this need for flexible scaling, for example, during runtime, because you exactly know who is using the application, and usually these are not that many users that you may need, like scaling on the back end to serve the needs of the application. That's an important fact, and that's why we do not care about the session.
Der Stefan Kolotschik.
Yeah, sorry. Michael? Oh, so it was a question. Okay. Now let's come to the Vaadin Flow. Vaadin Flow is the Java UI component API. Vaadin Flow is also the architecture that I will show you in a diagram after this slide, how client server is communicating. Today, or from the beginning, it uses web components. Today, it uses lit, as I said. And the important stuff is, or the important thing is that it uses no REST API. It uses REST, or it uses AJAX, to be fair, not REST, to do the communication. But you as a developer do not need to implement the REST API. And that's a very important fact because you will save time. Usually you create a UI like with Angular, and you create the backend, and then you have to create the REST API. You have to test this REST API. You have to secure this REST API, and this is not necessary with this approach. So you build a more secure application maybe, and on the other hand, you save time. You save a lot of time because you don't have to deal with this data communication layer. But you will have this bidirectional data binding. That means the user can change on the client side something that will be reflected on the server side. If you change something on the server side, it will immediately be reflected on the client side. On the other hand, Vaadin Fusion, if you're interested in, check it out. It's a good alternative, but you stay in the Vaadin ecosystem. That means Vaadin comes with a lot of components that you can use, and you can use these components also outside of Vaadin. By the way, yesterday I was in a talk from Adrian Bean. He was talking about lit or lit HTML, and he uses Vaadin router. That's a component from Vaadin, for example, that he used in his talk, where he demonstrated how to do web development with web components. Now, before I go to the demo, let's see the architecture. So, as I said, we have the backend. We have a business logic in services. You have persistence in repositories, for example. You can use whatever you like in the backend. It doesn't matter. And you write your user interface code in Java. You have components. So we have the server-side components. You can also use HTML templates. So you can split the UI from the UI logic, like you do with other technologies, like, for example, if you do like timeleaf templates. And you have a complete theming capability, so you can do different themes. For example, if you're creating a product, you can have multiple themes, one for each customer, or what's today very common, you have a light theme and a dark theme, and the user can choose what theme that you want to use. And this is all built in the framework. You don't have to care about it. You just have to use it. And then the communication, that's the special part. The components on the server side will be reflected as web components on the client side. The HTML template for sure will be there also, and the theme will be there as well. During development, you have a development mode like you do when you build Angular and have Webpack. Vaadin uses Webpack as well. And if you want to build this application for production, then you do a production build and you get all this minified and packaged together stuff as you are doing when you use any of these single page application frameworks. So how to start? Starting is very easy because there's a start.vaadin.com page. And you can here, as you see, you can choose from these two frameworks. You can go and choose Flow or Fusion. You can click there and you can go ahead and create your application. That's very easy, and then you can have a look at the application afterwards. But first start to have a look how this will look. And if you're a Java developer and ever used AWT, Swing, JavaFX, whatever UI framework, then this will look very familiar because you have a text field, you have a label, you have a button. What's special here, you extend from a layout. So Vaadin has different layouts. You have a horizontal layout, vertical layout, a form layout. And you can also extend from HTML components like a div, for example, or from any other that's available. And that's how you build a view. So that's your view. And this looks like this. If you go to the code, we can see the same. Then we have this hello view with the code. Here we see some other things. You build a route. That's the main difference for people that are using Vaadin 8 or Vaadin previous to Vaadin 10. Vaadin Flow embraces also the traditional HTML, HTTP or web application approach. So it uses the URL. That means a route is bound to a specific URL. Here we don't have a name. I can add the URL part or the path that I want to use. But if I don't do that, then view is the standard suffix of a route, and then this view will be accessible under the path hello. I can add a page title. I can also do a dynamic page titling if I want to support internationalization, for example. That's it. And if you run that, then it looks like this. So we have here, we have here the application. And we have the hello page, and I can enter like a name and greet, and this is all what's happening. Interestingly, we can see if I can show this. We should have a look what happens, and that's the interesting part of the Vaadin application. So if I change that to something else and greet, then we can see that here these AJAX requests are executed. And if you look here at what happens is that we post to somewhere. We have a UID that's like for the session stuff. And other things, we also have a cookie because it's stateful. But what's interesting is the response. And let me check the right response here. We get something back that looks like JSON or JavaScript. And here we can see that the state from the server comes to the client. So that means the code that we have here. So when someone clicks on the button, I say hello and add the value of the text field. And that's what's in the response. So Vaadin gets back this response, and what Vaadin does, it renders the UI. So it prints here, hello audience. That's the way it works. And I can do that multiple times, and you will always see these requests here. So that's the way it works. This is all the magic. So you don't have to care about that. You will also not be in contact usually. What you can do, you can execute JavaScript on the server, or you can tell Vaadin to execute JavaScript, and it will send this JavaScript snippets to the client, and on the client side, this JavaScript will be executed as well. So you can also press, for example, the button on the server side. This will then initiate the button press on the server, on the client side. And that's all the magic. That's it. And this all happens in a new way. So it's no longer GWT, as I told you. It's all done by the Flow framework. Routing is something that I already told you. You can also have query parameters or path variables as you have with the REST API, for example. So you can implement a certain interface, and then you will get the method where you get in, for example, the path variable, or you can get the location from the event and get the query parameters that are set. So Vaadin applications will become fully bookmarkable. So the URL that you have, you can send it to a user, for example, and it can click on the link, and then he's where he should be. So that's a very important thing, because bookmarkability is very important for most web applications. Now, why is Vaadin something interesting for business application? Vaadin is an application framework that really helps using or creating data-centric applications, because it brings all the components that you need. And one important component, if you want to build data-centric applications, is a grid. So you want to display data in a list or in a table. And the grid helps you in terms of a grid in Vaadin is lazy loaded. So what does this mean? You get paging for free, or for free is a bit, you have paging built in. And paging with Vaadin means, we can go back here and check this out. Paging means that you have endless scrolling like this. So you don't have buttons, you have a scroll bar, and when you go down, then Vaadin will reload the data on the fly. The grid is sortable, filterable, editable is also possible. So you can have inline editing in grids without problem, and you can add components to the grid. So here we, for example, have the grid, that these are our employees. We see the name, the department. We can sort here by name, for example. We can sort by ID. You see this will create a stable sort. So it will be sorted by multiple columns. And we can have components like a button inside of the grid. And if we hit edit, we will fire up a dialog. You can navigate to another page. That's just for demo purposes. I don't know if dialog is the best component in a web application, but it looks quite nice here. So I choose that for the demo. So the grid is very handy, and the grid relies on something called DataProvider. So you not only have grids, you also have combo boxes, for example, or list elements where you need to display multiple data records. And with data providers, there are a variety of implementations of this data providing. You also have list data providers. So if you have just a few, let's say 12 records, then you may not need this paging, then you can directly pass a list. But usually you have a lot of data, especially in a system like an ERP system, you have thousands, millions of records maybe, and you want to page. And to page, you can create a data provider. And here in this example, we see that we have two methods. One method is to get the data. Here we have a simple Spring Data repository with the find all method, and we can use the query that is provided here in this function. And the query contains the paging information, it contains the filtering information, and it contains the sorting information. And together with that, you can then access the data. And on the other hand, the second method is a count method. The count method in the newest version of Vaadin is optional. So you don't need this count method, because sometimes you don't have this count. So let's say the data doesn't come from the database. The data may come from a REST API that you access. Then you usually don't have a way to count the elements that you may get by the REST request that you do. So it's probably better not to do the count, even on the database. If you have a complex query to get the data, maybe the count query becomes slow. So you may not want to execute the count before the find all. What's the consequence of not having a count? The point is when you look at the example here, this scroll bar size is always the same, and that's because of the count. So Vaadin knows about the number of elements that it has to display. On the other hand, if you don't provide a count, then this scroll bar here may change if you page, because Vaadin will reload and see, oh, there are many more elements. So the scroll bar may become smaller with the time. So that's why a count callback makes a nicer UI. If you don't have a count callback, you can add a count estimate, and then this problem is a bit less important in terms of the UX. The other thing that you need to build a data-centric application are forms. So we've already seen that. I fire up a dialog, for example, with the form. And the form needs validation, it needs conversion, and you need to bind the data to the form. And for all that, Vaadin has a concept called binder, and you tell Vaadin to use this. And if you have here, look, we have this employee dialog. This extends from dialog. That's again a Vaadin component. I can set the height and the width. That's just for demo purposes. I usually would do that with styling. Vaadin supports CSS3, so we can style everything with CSS. And here we have a form layout. Form layout is a special component from Vaadin that allows you to arrange labels and fields with the label on top or the label on the left side, or also the other way around if you are building something that is read from right to left. And we create fields here, the text field, for example, and now we have the binder. So let's see the name field. We say we have a required indicator visible. That's also something that you can do, so that you have a star or a point that indicates that this field is required. And then you create the binder for exactly that field. And you can have a validator, for example, where you can provide a message. This message can be translated, so this is all built in. But interesting here is that you have the binding, and here you can pass the method reference for the get and the set, for example, of the name. Here with the ID on top, we see we only provide a get, so this will directly tell Vaadin that it's just a read-only field and you cannot edit the field. So if we look here, we have the ID that is not editable, but we can here edit all the other fields. Then something else that you often need, let's say we have a button, for example, and we can create a PDF document from our list of data. And this may take a while, and you don't want to block the user, then you can do that in the background. So for example, you can use the Spring task executor and execute a runnable here. Here's a sleep that is just for demo purposes. And then when the heavy lifting is done, then you have to notify the UI, and the UI needs to be, I can say it's more or less the same as you do a traditional Windows or desktop application. You have to find the right thread to do that. Here you have to find the right UI to do that. So you can't send data in the thread that you are currently in, but you have to get the UI from Vaadin and then access this UI, and then you can post a notification, for example. And this is very handy because you absolutely don't have to do anything to use that, only add push annotation to your application, and that's it. On the background, Vaadin will use Atmosphere. Atmosphere is a WebSocket framework that also has fallback mechanisms if, for example, the WebSocket communication is not possible for firewall reasons, for example, or something like that. Another interesting thing is how you test the application. Here you can see there's a red warning on this page. Vaadin is open source, but Vaadin has kind of a dual licensing model. So that means you can use Vaadin for free. But there are certain components like special web components or also the testing framework that are not free. So you need a subscription to use that. But the subscription is worth the money because you get a lot of support directly from the Vaadin team, not from a dedicated support team, but from people that know Vaadin and are also developing on the Vaadin framework. That's a very important difference maybe to other companies. And what Testbench does, it extends Selenium. So you may know Selenium. It's a testing framework that uses web drivers. So you have this Chrome driver, for example, to remote control the browser to do browser tests. And that's exactly what Vaadin is doing as well. But because Vaadin is relying on web components and Selenium, as far as I know, does not directly support web components, so they added this capability. So for every web component from Vaadin, you have a corresponding element class that you can use then to test this. So for example, you can have here like this jQuery syntax where you can say, I want to have a text field element. Here I get the first one. For sure, it's better to access the text field by ID. But here in this case, I only have one. So I just choose the first. I can set the value. I can hit a button, for example, or send keys. And then I can check if the label contains the text, for example, that I expect. That's the way this testing works. That's very handy. We do a lot of testing in our project. So we decided to invest time in the front-end testing because this becomes quite easy with this Testbench framework. It's a lot of work, you know, testing, UI testing is always a lot of work because if the UI changes, you have to change the tests, you have to think about test data management, stuff like that. But it's well worth because you will be sure that it works. And it all has the capabilities that you may know from Selenium. So for example, if the test fails, you get a screenshot, you can see how the screen looked when the test was executed, for example, or when the test was failed. And that's really worth the effort because it really helps to provide better applications. As I said, a Vaadin application is a single page application, but it's also possible to have this progressive web application support. Progressive web application support means that you have an application that you, for example, can install on the browser or on the operating system, as I should say. For that, you need a web manifest with an icon, with the description stuff. That's also what you may have seen if I reload the page. Here on the bottom here, I get the notification. And here I can click on install, for example. And then it will install the application on Chrome. And then I have this application without the browser stuff around. So it looks more like a native application. That's one thing. But on the other hand, what I also can do, I can get some offline support where I can use a cache, for example. So you have access to this service worker infrastructure where you can use the browser on this side, and you can have push notifications to the browser even if your application is not open in any tab or window of the browser. So that's the first framework that we were using, and this works very well because of the fact that we can use plain Java. We don't need to have access to all the framework. If we have a look at the application project here, you can see that more or less what we have here in the POM is just some configuration. We have a bill of material from Vaadin with all the versions. We directly use Spring Boot as a parent. And then we have a Vaadin dependency, we have a Spring Booter, Vaadin and stuff. So it's very easy, but if you look at the project, we have a front-end folder, for example, and we have a node modules. We also have package.json, we have webpack config, and this is all generated by Vaadin because Vaadin uses the same technology as you would use if you build a normal web application. So now Vaadin we are already a bit far in the time. Do you have any questions to me about Vaadin? Do you like something to need? Is Vaadin a good choice for a website that needs search engine optimization? Yes. Or the point is, it depends if you really want to build a customer-facing application with Vaadin. You can use that. It also works because Vaadin.com, the application from Vaadin, or the website from Vaadin, is all built with Vaadin for sure. And you have the same capabilities as you have with other single-page application frameworks. So you have this HTML page that is generated. You can add as many metadata as you want because you have access to this data, to this page. I can't show you here because it's not the production build, but you can provide the index HTML, for example, that is downloaded. That's no problem. Does Vaadin offer live reloading? Yes, it does, for sure. During development, you mean, you have, I can change something and it immediately reloads the page. You have live reload, that's there, because at the end, Webpack is used in the client as you have with any other framework. Yes, Vaadin will work behind the redirecting proxy as well. There's no reason why this shouldn't work at all. Any other questions? Okay, then I will take the last 5 minutes to have a word about jOOQ. Data access is often used, or often Hibernate is used for database access if you have relational databases. As I said in the beginning, we have 2,000 tables, we have 5,000 stored procedures that we want to access, and this doesn't work with Hibernate simply. Hibernate is a norm mapping framework where you usually have the approach that you first design maybe your entity model, or you have a domain-driven design approach with aggregates and entities, and you want to persist that. In a data-centric application, that's maybe not the right approach. The right approach here, or the approach that we had to do or have to use, was having a database first approach. And if you have a database first approach, or want to have a very good performing database heavy application, you may want to use SQL as the programming language. For sure, you can use Spring Data, JDBC, for example, to do that, but then you will end up with some strings, and even if you have now multi-line string with the latest Java versions, but it may not be very handy. And jOOQ is a library that provides type-safe SQL with Java because it contains 2 components. It has a generator and it has a domain-specific language. The generator is simply a Maven plugin, or you can use it in the Gradle as well, that generate based on any database or even on database scripts. That's what I use in my demo. It generates a Metamodel. So it generates a Metamodel like here. You have like a table with all the fields or the columns. And what you can do with that, you can execute then type-safe SQL, because the DSL allows you to use SQL statements, or it looks like SQL, or the DSL follows SQL. And all the things that we can hear in the uppercase are constant names, for example, the table name or the name of the database column. And now everything is type safe. So you can only write valid SQL, first of all, because of the jOOQ DSL, and you can only use types, names of the database that are there, because you generate the Metamodel from the database with every build. And if you change the database, it will also change this Metamodel. And if the Metamodel does not fit the database anymore, if you used it, then you will have compile time errors. So you are on a better level because you are sure on the compile time that your SQL statement will work. If it does the right thing, it's something completely different. For that, you have to write tests, but you know it will execute and it is correct. That's the point. Here we only have like select, insert, and stuff, but what's very important, we have a lot of stored procedures, and the cool thing about stored procedures, jOOQ generates a class per procedure or function, and you can use it like a Java class. So you will not even notice that you execute a stored procedure in the database. So for that reason, for us, it really doesn't matter if the database has the business logic, because we have a nice abstraction layer on top in Java where you can directly access the underlying database business logic. And if you want to do like create, read, update, and delete, then you can use the updatable record. For every table, jOOQ generates a record. And if the table has a primary key, jOOQ will generate an updatable record that comes with some methods like refresh, store, and delete. And then you have kind of an active record pattern where you can directly use this to use it with your application to create such a CRUD application. And yes, for sure it supports packages. It will create a class for the package, and it will also create for every function in the package, it will create, or for every procedure or function in the package, it will create a class that's then also is in the Java package namespace of the packages. That works. Yes, we all the 5,000 procedures and functions that we use are all organized in packages in the Oracle database. And just before I come to the end, I like to show you how nicely this works, because I think I have the employee view here with the combination of Vaadin and jOOQ. And here we see that I do a data provider. And here I have a view, for example, of an employee. And then we see that I use directly the DSL context, the DSL from jOOQ to create my SQL statement, and also for the count statement. So that works pretty well. And also the querying, so creating the where condition, for example, is here in my case a condition. So if I have a filter in my application, let's see if I can do that as the thing. We have the employees. And if I hit here, for example, I say Bob, then I just get the Bob. And this query here, so I have the filter with the change listener. What I do, I create a predicate. So that's the where part of the query then, where I directly use here, it's an upper function provided by DSL of jOOQ, where I create a like where condition at the end. Okay, just a question about the redirecting proxy. WebSockets are problematic. Yes, that's why they use Atmosphere, because Atmosphere also does long polling. So it has a fallback mechanism if it doesn't work. And if this is distributed, then it's not a WebSocket anymore. But the WebSockets are only used if you want to use push. And it depends if you, in what terms you want to do the push. In our case, the push is to inform the user about something that happens in the background. But this is again a special for our application. By the way, our customer does not use Vaadin on the client, because they have also mobile applications, for example, for the warehouses, and they build native applications. Okay, for me to conclude is for Java developers. So I'm talking about Java developers, I don't talk about front-end developers. Creating the UI with Vaadin in Java is much easier. You save time because you know how the programming model works, And you don't have to care about the REST API, for example. If you're doing plain CRUD applications, you even can omit the service layer because you can directly access, for example, the database from the Vue logic. And with that, you can use jOOQ that really creates a benefit because it creates type-safe SQL statements. And Vaadin and jOOQ form a very good combination to develop these data-centric business applications. What I didn't told you is that jOOQ also take care of the underlying database, because jOOQ can emulate certain functionality that is not available in certain databases. So in that case, this works very well. We also use, or we don't use because we have a huge database, but in other projects, I use test containers, for example, in combination with this. And then we also have in the tests or for generating the model directly from a test container database, for example. And yes, there is a editor. It's called Vaadin Designer. It's a IntelliJ plugin that you can use to design your UI. But to be honest, it depends a bit on the application that you do. If you're doing something simple, it's maybe not necessary to use this editor. If you're doing something more complex, it may become handy, but when your UI becomes dynamic, then maybe a UI designer is not very useful. But if you just want to click together your application, then you can use the Vaadin Designer for sure. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Are there any other questions still? It seems not to be the case. So thank you very much and have a nice and hopefully educational conference.